Hello, welcome to my presentation. I'm your host, Sergio Don Corleone, and today we're going to be looking at bluff raising versus river pros. So today you will learn, of course, regarding bluff raising facing river pros, and it's going to be mainly focused on single raise spots in position versus big blind. We're going to be learning how to select the best combos. So this is going to be choosing blockers, maybe showdown value, and just overall which hands are best for bluff raising. We're going to try to use the correct sizings, and we're going to learn which variables will affect our sizing one way or the other. We're going to try to learn what to do on different runouts. Of course, different rivers, different cards are going to affect our frequencies, our sizings, and how we're going to play, even our blockers. And a very important thing is interpreting our opponent's line. So depending on what he does, what he is representing with his line, we need to, approach it differently with our own value and bluffs when it comes to raising. And ultimately, our goal is going to be to learn how GTO works, learn how balance roughly works, and be able to detect leaks, detect mistakes in our opponent's strategy to capitalize on them. So let's start with this kind of funny slide, which basically, if you've never studied in depth a certain spot, you are generally going to be making one of these mistakes where you can be one of these players where you're either an autopilot, so you don't care about the table, the pot is too small, it's just a 5 big blind pot, who cares? You're just going to have air and it's not fold. You could be my blockers look cool, right? So this is a type of player that is trying to do something, right? He's trying to play better, but ultimately he's not thinking enough about ranges. He's not thinking enough about frequencies. And therefore he's just looking at his blockers, making random decisions at random frequencies. So he's going to be exploitable, and he's not really capitalizing on other people's mistakes because he's not even paying attention to other people's mistakes. Then the type of guy who's the RNG says 99, therefore I'm going to bluff raise. This is, very similar to the previous type. Just you, instead of guiding your strategy based on thinking about your ranges, and maybe after you think about your ranges, after you think about combos, after you have thought about all that, maybe you RNG, but no, this guy is just looks at RNG and lets it decide for him. So he's going to also be exploitable. He's not adjusting enough to different runouts. And again, he doesn't exploit anyone because he's not even paying attention to that. Now we have the exploitative question mark player, who's a guy that thinks that being exploitative is just, if you bet too small, I'm going to bluff raise you, right? If you bet 1/3, he's just going to bluff raise you. And ultimately, what we're trying to be is a good, well-rounded player. We can guesstimate balanced strategies. So we're not going to be ever perfectly balanced, but we can kind of like guesstimate better than other people where equilibrium lies. And we can also be tricky, be exploitative in any way we want. And we can also try to outplay and be 2 steps ahead of our opponents. So let's talk about raising frequency, specifically bluff raising frequency versus river pros. So there are these 3 main variables that I wrote down here. Now, there are obviously almost an infinite amount of variables, but I try to distill the ones that are most readily available and affect our decisions the most. Okay, so it doesn't mean that these 3 are the only things you could be thinking about. So 1, Villain's river probe sizing. Basically, if your opponent probes smaller, we're going to have to value raise more, and bluff raise more. If your opponent bets bigger, we're going to value raise less and therefore bluff raise less. The river card. Okay, the river card is very important because when we check back the turn after betting the flop, we're going to cap our range, right? And so the river card is going to decide whether we stay capped, whether we get uncapped, and to what degree. And ultimately, decider for how often to bluff raise is going to be how much value we represent. Okay, so we need to be nuanced and flexible and not try to see the game as a very narrow set of variables. But at the end of the day, we need to think dynamically about how much value would we have on this runout, what sizing would we use with this value, etc. Okay, so let's start with a quiz. Which of these increased frequency? And I'm of course talking about bluff raising frequency, which is of course tied directly to our overall raising frequency after checking back the turn. So versus river pro. So let me start the vote. So we have facing a smaller bet, right? If we face a smaller bet, we raise more often. Facing a bigger bet, of course, one of these two must be wrong necessarily. C, river is an overcard. It's an interesting one. D, river completes a flush. And E, river is a complete brick. I see you guys voting mainly for facing a smaller bet and river is an overcard. Those are the main winners right now. Let's give it a few more seconds for people to settle their decision. So I think we're all settled, and let's look at the answers. So, I mean, I kind of hinted at this or directly said it, that when you face a smaller bet, you are going to raise more often. And the reason is because the smaller the bet you face, the thinner the value that your opponent is representing, and also the less nutted hands he has in that value range. Therefore, we're going to value raise very thin ourselves against that range, which is going to end up making us bluff raise a lot more. Facing a bigger bet is, of course, the opposite, so it's not going to be the case. Now, river's an overcard. It's an interesting one because when we check back the turn, as I said before, we're capped, but a river overcard is going to give us new top pairs. And if we pair this understanding with the idea that on the flop we bet, right? On the flop we bet, therefore our opponent is going to fold a good amount of overcards. So when we check back that turn, we're going to hit more of that river overcard than our opponent. So yes, this is going to increase our value raise frequency, our bluff raise frequency, etc. And the other one that we marked as green is river completes a flush. Now, this one is a bit more nuanced because it's not 100% of the time, right? So the idea is that when we are checking back the turn, we're very capped, of course, right? By the river completing a flush, we are uncapping our range. Now, this is going to depend on specific sizings that we face. For example, if we face a bigger sizing on river, we're going to need stronger hands to raise, right? And so having flushes to raise is very helpful. Whereas when we face a smaller river bet, maybe we don't really need a flush, and therefore hitting the flush doesn't increase as much our frequency. It's a bit nuanced, but you know, I kept it as a right answer. And then river is a brick is not right because you could say that river being a brick is almost the standard frequency, right? Let's look at some of these examples. So villain's river sizing. Okay, let's explain how this works. Villain sizing tells us what value hands they're representing. Okay, the smaller the bet, the more marginal hands they're value betting, and the less nutted hands they're betting, right? And therefore we can raise for thinner value against that. That dictates our value raise thresholds. And then how much value we can raise dictates how often we can raise overall, and of course with bluffs as well. So let's look at this example. All right, so the example is A7-3 rainbow, button versus big blind single raise pot. We bet 1/3 on flop. He calls, 2, check, check, and the jack comes. Okay, and we can try different sizings and see. So versus a 60% bet, we're raising around 11-12% of the time to this 80% sizing, right? Hands that we will be raising as bluffs are going to be bottom pairs over here, some second pairs over here. And this kind of illustrates another idea that I wanted to talk about, which is that some people might see this second pair raising and think to himself, why would I bluff raise when I can just call, right? And this is a misconception when it comes to bluff raising the river, because when we say I'm not going to bluff because I can do this other action with my hand. What we're really saying is that I'm not going to bluff because bluffs are generally very close to zero profitability. And I have this other action that I can take that is more profitable. Okay, that's what's behind that phrase. Now, in the case of bluff raising the river, if you have a bluff catcher, you are going to basically have zero EV against a bet, right? So calling, even if it's slightly profitable, is going to be slightly profitable based on blockers only. It's going to be very close to zero EV. The same way bluff raising is very close to zero EV and is possibly profitable based on blockers. So both bluff catching and bluff raising are work in a very similar way in that regard, where if you have a hand that can beat all of the bluffs but doesn't beat any of the value, that's at least a candidate that you should be considering for bluff raising. So let's look at different sizings. So when we face an overbet, we are supposed to raise around 6%, 5%. We see that our value hands is going to be 2 pair sets, right? So given that our value is very narrow, we're also going to bluff a very narrow amount of bluffs. So we're only going to choose basically the best blockers / unblockers and to a rather low frequency, right? So queen deuce. The reason why having a board pair is good for bluff raising is because, first of all, you're blocking 2 pair plus. Okay, that's a good thing. And also your opponent is unlikely to be bluffing with a pair. Your opponent is unlikely to be bluffing with a pair. And therefore, if you have a pair, you are unblocking his high card bluffs, right? So this is why hands like this are good blockers / unblockers. And then again, blocking the jack is very good as well. If we look back at the facing a 60% pro, we see again what we saw before, around 11, 12% raise frequency. And if we face a small bet, we're going to be raising actually a hell of a lot more. So higher than 20%, 21, 22%. So let's look at some of those bluffs. And this is going to be interesting for some of you guys, which is that, yes, we use some of those blocker type hands that we talked about before. Now we are not raising with a jack ever. Okay, we're not raising with a jack. And the reason against a small bet we're not raising with a jack is that our opponent now is value betting a jack some portion of the time, right? If our opponent is value betting a jack some percentage of the time, now when we have a jack ourselves, we're either blocking a lot of value or we're even beating value. And if we're beating value, now the call is high EV and not just zero or close to zero, right? So kind of the rule is if you have a pure bluff catcher, you can consider bluff raising. If you have a hand that starts beating value, that's probably not a hand that you should be thinking about bluff raising with. So we're not choosing those jack X, but we're still choosing some of those 2, 7, right? But now the hand that we're using that we weren't using before is hands like 9, 6 of spades. So basically complete nothing, right? This would be an unblocker type of hand. Okay, another variable that is going to affect our river frequency a lot is which card comes on the river, right? As we said multiple times already, we cap ourselves by checking back the turn, and the river is critical on deciding the degree of our cappedness. So we're looking at this board, which is 10-8-5 rainbow. Again, bottom versus big blind, single raise pot. Now there's a few differences. One is that we now bet half pot for flop instead of betting small. That's a minor difference. And we're going to look at different river cards. Okay, so let's look at a card like A3, which is going to be a rather bricky card. Yes, there are some draws that hit, like Ace4 mainly, but for the most part, it doesn't really hit much. And as we can see, we're raising good 10x against a medium-sized bet. And let's look at our bluffs. So again, some of these 5x hands or pair, 7-6. This is a bit of a blocker type hand, slash unblocker. And yeah, we can see all of these hands. Now, the interesting thing is that if we change the river to a king, so first of all, let's pay attention to the frequency at which we're overall raising, which is around 11, 12%. If we change this to a king, as we said before, the king is going to uncap our range. We're going to have a lot of top pairs now that our opponent doesn't, and therefore we can value raise a lot, and therefore we should also bluff raise a lot. And the main bluff that we're using is actually a 5. Okay, we're raising a lot of 5x over here. Again, the board pairs unblock bluffs and block some 2-pair plus. Another runout that would be interesting to look at is going to be a card like the 3 of diamonds. So the 3 of diamonds, we said before that it would increase our frequency at least sometimes to hit a flush on a check back. And this is one of the cases where it does increase a little bit. And the reason is because, we hit a decent amount of flushes. So if we look at the bluffs now, we're using more of those diamond blockers. Okay, so the morphology of the ranges is going to change a lot based on the runout. And we're going to be talking about this later a little bit more. So frequency summary. The bigger our opponent bets, the less value we will raise ourselves, therefore reducing the amount of bluffs. Okay, very intuitive. Overcards, some draw completers, and specific board pairings will increase our frequency, right? Now, there's a lot of nuance in which draw completers and which board pairings will increase our frequency. For instance, if you c-bet the flop very big, you're not going to have a lot of second pair, right, on flop. So when that card pairs later, that's not going to be a good card for your range. Whereas if you bet 1/3 on flop, you're going to have a lot of second pair. Therefore, when that second pair pairs after you check back the turn, okay, now that's a different story. That's a card that helps your value raises on river. Complete bricks or some cards that mainly help your opponent will have lower frequencies. I mean, this is pretty obvious. It takes practice though to be able to differentiate which draw completers, which board pairings, which cards that ultimately change the board help you and which ones help your opponent. So let's talk a little bit about blockers. So good blockers for bluff raising the river is going to be either blocking draws completing, unblocking draws from that bricked, or pairs that block 2-pair plus and a block bluff. So we've already talked about this last portion. We'll talk a little bit more about the 2 first ones. So, okay, so let's look at these blockers over here. This is King 10-4 two-tone, bottom versus big blind, single raise pot. We bet 1/3 on flop, turn is a 2, check, check, and the 9 of spades comes on the river. We face a small bet, okay? So now, good blockers are going to be, as I said before, we want to be blocking draws that completed, okay? which draw is completed? Queen Jack is now straight, and two spades are now a flush, right? So the blockers that we want to have are a spade, a queen, or a jack. So let's look at the bluffs. And indeed, what we see is that we want to have a queen, sometimes a jack. Board pairs are nice to have. And then the rest of hands are going to be hands mostly with a spade, right? So 9-8 is blocking the 2-pair plus and blocking flushes. Hands like Queen 9 is blocking the straight and blocking a pair. Ace 9 is blocking the nut flush and the 2-pair plus. And these pocket pairs over here, they're blocking the flush, right? So one thing that's important though is that if you look at how the solver is playing this spot, it's not picking every hand that kind of looks reasonable as a bluff raise and just bluff raising it always, right? Because like what some people will do is they'll just see a hand that has some blockers and they'll just, go for it. The solver is, at least with some hands, restricting its frequencies. And we'll talk later about some leads that the imposition player can make, which will be interesting. So let's look now at a more bricky run-up, like a 7 of clubs, for example, facing the same small bet on river. And let's look at the bluffs now. So now our value raise is more revolving around King X, and actually queens and a little bit of jacks is still raising versus this bet. And that might surprise some people, but in fact, it's very intuitive that if you face a really, really tiny bet, 27% of the pot, the value that you're facing is mostly a 10. Okay, there is some King X in there, but it's mostly a 10. And therefore, raising with a hand like queens becomes very profitable. So let's look at some of those bluffs. So now what we are going to want to have, since no draws completed, and in fact, a lot of draws bricked, our opponent's bluffs are going to basically revolve around the hands that he called on the flop, right? So he called on the flop with some air, some floats, which are going to be gut shots, open-enders, flush draws, and some backdoor flush draws, right? So what we would prefer to have is going to be not block the backdoor flush draws, not block the gut shots that busted, not block the flush draws that busted. And also low cards are going to be pretty good to have. For example, 6-5, right? 6-5 is just very, very low cards that don't really interact with our opponent's range. And therefore, we allow him to have his full frequency of bluffs almost. So 6-5, had like 7-5, 6-4. So still board pairing is important. And yeah, and some of these, even though here we have the queen, which you could say, oh, it blocks it still blocks some of the, for instance, Queen 7 is, yes, it's blocking spades and it's blocking the busted straight draw, but the 7 itself is blocking 2-pair plus. So there are some competing incentives that will still allow you to raise some hands that are not super clear. And the main reason is because we're facing a small bet. Basically, the bigger the bet we face, the more strict our blocker choice is going to be. So as we can see here with Queen 8, we're not choosing the spades, and the hearts are relatively worse than other suits, right? Let's talk now about sizings, okay? And sizings is a very, very complex topic, but ultimately it all boils down to one thing, which is what sizing you would choose with value, okay? The reason for this is because if you choose sizing that you wouldn't choose with value, a thinking opponent might suss that out. He might understand that you're not really repping a real hand, and he will therefore, call you more often if you choose a suspicious sizing, right? So we need to think about what value we would have and try to represent that value with our sizing. Figure out what hand class or groups of value hands we have available to raise at a reasonable frequency, and choose one or a few sizings to balance those out. And balance is in quotes because we can never truly balance out a range, but we can roughly know how to very, very in broad strokes balance it. Let's talk about sizing a little bit more. When we hit clear non-nutted value on the river overcards, our sizing will generally revolve around those. Okay, when we check back the turn and we hit quote unquote non-nutted value, so an overcard, our value range is going to be revolving by far mostly around top pair, right? And so our sizing is going to be the top pair sizing. When river is a complete brick, not even impacting two pair, we will also generally use one sizing. And the reason is because the hands that we will raise on river is mainly going to just be top pairs that we didn't value bet on turn, right? So it's still going to be a top pair centric value. And when river gives us two pair or complete draws, we will generally develop multiple sizings. This is a very obvious idea, which is that if you are going to raise some top pairs and then also some two pairs, some flushes, some different hand classes, each one of those hand classes is going to prefer a different sizing. So we can look at an example for that, which is, so for instance, on a board like this. So for instance, on a board like this, if the river comes 9 of spades, we're raising many different sizings, right? Because we are hitting straights on river, we're hitting flushes. Some of those flushes want to go all in, as you can see, this blue sizing. Some of those hands like a straight, it's going to overbet. We're going to raise some two pairs to a more middling sizing. And therefore our bluffs need to mimic that, right? We're going to look at our bluffs. We're going to see that different bluffs are going to mimic different sizings. So these very weak blockers, let's say, right? So 9-6 over here, we're blocking two pair plus, and the 6 of diamonds is an unblocker. So these are rather not very strong blockers, and therefore those go small. With these hands, we're trying to block two pair, basically. And therefore we choose a sizing that targets two pair. With a hand like, ace queen with the queen of spades, or ace queen with the ace of spades, we're choosing bigger sizings, a lot bigger sizings. So overbets and even just all in right away. Now, if the river comes a brick, now we're not going to be using multiple sizings. And the reason is because our raise frequency or our raise range is revolving mostly around top pair, right? And even if we have a little bit of two pair, like king 7, when we only have a small percentage of nutted hands in our range, usually the way the solver plays it is by protecting the more abundant value range of weaker hands with the nutted hand in order to not be attacked in that way. So that's why to develop multiple sizings, you actually need a certain abundance of those hand classes. It doesn't count if you just have like a couple combos of two pair, right? Another example is, so when the overcard comes, our raising range also revolves around top pair. So, the solver has two sizings over here, which is 42% and 79%. But if you had for example, a half pot sizing or a 2/3 pot sizing, that would be a good simplification to just use potentially one sizing here. Basically, what I am referring to when I say multiple sizings or single sizing, I'm mostly referring to if you mostly use just medium sizes or if you're starting to use overbet raises and whatnot. So let's talk a little bit about leaks. Let's start by looking at the out of position player. Okay. The most common leaks is going to be the out of position player is either going to over bluff on a certain run out or he's going to under bluff. Okay. And this is accentuated by how big was the bet that he faced on flop. The reason is because if you bet small and your opponent calls, and for example, the river bricks, your opponent is still going to have all of those bricked draws available for bluffs. Whereas if you, for instance, bet big on flop, he's going to call less draws, right? He doesn't have as many draws available for bluffing, and he might even need to start bluffing with showdown value, pairs, etc. So that's when players might start under bluffing. And this is the key for this, is that generally speaking, the spots where bluff catching is good are the same spots where bluff raising is good, and vice versa, right? Because at the end of the day, most of the folds that you get by bluff raising are going to come from just air, right? At least a very big percentage of the folds you get are just going to come from air. So if your opponent is under bluffing, he's going to need to make a bigger mistake, a very big mistake with value in order for your bluff raise to be profitable, right? And on the flip side, if your opponent is over bluffing, he's going to need to station a lot with value to manage to not overfold to the bluff raise. So let's look at some instances where those leaks could become real. So let's look back at this board right here. Let's imagine, right? We are on king 10-4, button versus big blind. We bet 1/3 of flop, we get called, and it checks through. And let's say the 7 comes, right? A brick. Now, our opponent is going to have a lot of intuitive bluffs available. He's going to have some ace high, some gut shots, flush draws, maybe some backdoor flush draw. And as we can see in the sim, he should give up some of the air, right? He should pretty much never bluff with ace high and should give up some of the air. Therefore, if someone is just spamming bets without thinking about his range, he is more likely to be over bluffing. Now, this is accentuated also by the sizing they use. If they use a sizing that doesn't really make sense, right? Then that could be even more over bluff. So that's a very important variable to think about. What sizing is he choosing? Is he actually repping value, or is he choosing a sizing that doesn't really make that much sense? On the flip side, let's look at a different situation. So the 9 of spades. And let's look at, again, we just bet 1/3 on flop, but now the river completes a lot of those draws that he had available for bluffing. So now he's going to need to bluff every ace high. Okay, so the strategy changed a lot. Now he needs to bluff every ace high, and he actually needs to start bluffing a lot of bottom pair, and even not just bottom pair, but the fourth pair, right? So a lot of pairs are being bluffed, and all of the ace high. Now, this is something that a lot of people are not run out aware or run out flexible enough to change their strategy, and therefore they will end up over bluffing on one and under bluffing on the other. And generally speaking, you want to be attacking a lot versus the range that's over bluffed, and you want to be careful and avoid the range that is under bluffed. So let's talk a little bit about in-position leaks, okay? So there are a few possible, I mean, there are a lot of leaks possible, but the most common ones that I can think of is either being not aggressive enough or too aggressive. This is very basic level 1 exploit type thinking, where if your opponent is a nit and you bet and he raises, he probably doesn't bluff a lot, right? Like that's the type of guy that's playing many tables, 20 tables. He's not paying attention to a 5-6 big blind pot. And therefore, when he faces the bet and has air, it's just going to fold, right? So that player will be just not aggressive enough. Against that kind of player, the main exploit is don't call his raises, right? And you have other players that are too aggressive, right? So players that are just looking for any excuse, like blockers, like just whatever excuse to raise. And therefore, against that player, the level 1 basic exploit is going to be to just call a lot. But there are a little bit more nuanced leaks that are dependent on the runout. And those leaks appear when your opponent's not runout aware, right? Your opponent can be overall looking balanced when you look at his overall stats, but if he's not runout aware, he's going to be over bluffing on one runout and under bluffing on a different runout, right? And these can be based on our sizing, based on block, or based on block. So let's talk a little bit briefly about based on our sizing. So some players, when we bet small, they just go bananas, right? So we need to be careful about certain player profiles, betting it small against them, and over folding against their races. We need to be very careful about that. On the flip side, if we overbet, a player might never bluff raise us, for example. The other more interesting one that I want to talk about is a player that's not runout aware, and he plays based on blockers without really thinking about ranges, right? So let's look at an example and let's think about the exploits we could come up with. So I'm using this runout a lot because it's very interesting, and it does illustrate a lot of these concepts very well. So let's look at this runout again. When we bet small on flop, turn goes check, check, and our opponent bets a medium sizing on the river, right? And let's look at our bluffs. So we're raising Jack 9. I mean, this is a cool hand. It's a pair blocker, straight blocker, two pair blocker and straight blocker. We have jacks with a spade. It's a straight blocker, flush blocker, queens, straight blocker, flush blocker, queen 10 with a spade. It's blocks everything, right? But if you pay attention, the solver is doing it a sliver of the time with each hand. It's not doing a lot. And the reason is because we have a lot of those hands, right? We have a lot of hands that look like a straight blocker plus a flush blocker plus a two pair blocker. Like a big portion of our range is hands that look like that. And therefore, the solver is just picking a little bit of each. Now, the player that is thinking only about blockers and his hand is not thinking about ranges, he's going to be, I have good blockers. Queens with the spade. Oh, raising looks professional. It looks cool. So I'm going to do it. So what ends up happening is that on a board like this, and that if he doesn't check back enough flush draws, it's going to be even more accentuated, right? Because he's not going to have enough flushes. So if he checks back and then raises the river with all of those blocker hands, he's just going to be massively over bluffing, massively over bluffing. On the flip side, if that player is not really paying attention and he gets to a river like this, now he doesn't have those hands. There's no intuitive like straight plus flush plus whatever blocker. He should start using unblocker hands. Now, a player that is not very experienced might miss these types of 8-7 of hearts. 8-7 is a two pair blocker, but it's 8-6, 8-5. The player might miss these, and therefore on a run like this, he might not really be hitting enough of a raising frequency. So we need to be very aware of when we face one of these players that we think he's thinking mostly about blockers and not really about ranges, interactions, and the dynamics. We can kind of like read whether he's over bluffing or under bluffing by looking at the board in a very basic way. So to summarize, in order to decide when to bluff raise, we're going to need to think about these things. First of all, how much value do we have? And this, I've been stressing this out for the entire presentation because it's the most important thing. What are you doing with value? What sizing does that value prefer? Is our range or value raise range, is it very heavy on top pairs? Or do we have a lot of two pairs? Do we have a lot of flushes? Do we have a lot of etc.? Do we have good blockers? Do we have good unblockers? We need to pay attention to the board. And on some boards, there's no hands that we can choose with blockers itself, or not enough hands. So we need to choose some with unblockers. And on the flip side, on some boards, there's just a million hands that have good blockers, and we need to restrain our bluffs a little bit. And then one of the most important things is attack the over bluff ranges and avoid the under bluff ones. Okay, the over bluff ranges are the most likely to overfold to raises. The under bluffed ranges are unlikely to overfold to raises, even if you have cool looking blockers. And yeah, thanks for watching, guys. It's been a pleasure, and see you on my next presentation.